Hello, and welcome. My name is Daniel Chu. I'm the director of the Joint Advanced Warfighting Division here at the Institute for Defense Analyses. And I want to welcome all of you, both those of you who have joined us in person and those who have joined online for the official, finally, the official book launch for the Reflections on Net Assessment book that some of my colleagues have been editing for over the past year or so, and they're going to talk to you a little bit about that. I do want to say just a couple of words before they get into the substance of both what they've been doing and why we're here to discuss this particular book, by saying that IDA is particularly pleased to be hosting this event and to have supported the publication of this book. Because quite frankly, for decades, we have had worked with Andy Marshall and have worked with the Office of Net Assessment. So we're particularly proud, and it's an honor for us to do this. It's also been a really great pleasure working with the Andy Marshall Foundation. The collaboration has been wonderful. And of course, I'm very proud of Jeff McKitrick and Bob Angevine for having undertaken this effort and for presenting it here today. I'd also like to note that, at least from my perspective, Andy Marshall is often thought of and written about for the topics that he's provided really deep insight into, and for his long career and the personal influence he's had on U.S. defense thinking. But I also think it's really important to note the impact he's had on how we think about things and not just what we think about. I also think it's really important to remember and appreciate how he has promoted new thinking and new thinkers, and not just his own views as well. I like to think this is very much in keeping with what we try to do here at IDA. And I'll also say, on a personal note, I had the pleasure and honor of working for Andy Marshall about 20 years ago. He encouraged me to try and do new things and to explore some new topics as well. And quite frankly, has had a lasting impact on my career as well. So as I turn this over to Jamie, who will provide an introduction to the panel, I'll just lastly say I'm particularly proud and excited to be supportive of this particular publication because, as we all know, there's been a lot written about Andy Marshall and a lot said about Andy Marshall. This is Andy in his own words, and I think there's great value to that. So again, thank you very much for coming and for joining us online. Jamie, over to you.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate your remarks, and I want to start by, for those of you who are in the room and you get to see the new IDA, it's an incredible space, and congratulations to IDA and the architects and everybody else who put this building together. And for those of you who are online and listening or watching, unfortunately, we can't give you a view of it, but you ought to figure out a way to come visit, and I'm sure they'd love to see you. So on behalf of the Andrew W. Marshall Foundation, I really would like to thank everybody for joining us today. Our thanks, obviously, to Dan Chu and Nordy Schwartz and the Institute for Defense Analysis for co-sponsoring this project with us. And we couldn't be here today without the work of the editors, Jeff McKitrick and Bob Angevine, who I'll speak about in a minute, and the foundation team of Stephanie Papa, Lily Dernan, and Abigail McDonough. I'd also like to thank Vago Muradian, our moderator today. And finally, a big thank you to the person who made this really all possible, Andrew W. Marshall. So I just want to talk a little bit about the foundation and reflections. And just for most of you know Andy, most of you, but for those of you who don't, I'd just like to remind you, following on Dan's remarks, Andy created the foundation to identify and nurture people, just the same as what IDA does, and everybody. We find really good people. We look for good people, and but the foundation that Andy was focused on was people who brought creativity, honesty, passion, fearlessness, curiosity, and analytic rigor to challenging the orthodoxies surrounding the implications of long-term competitions for the United States. In a way, this describes Rand of the 1950s and 1960s, where Andy cut his teeth. It was a candy shop, if I can describe it that way, of budding intellectual giants. A lot of these people who started in the 50s, nobody really knew who they were. I mean, Andy, in a moment of candidness, when we asked him, why did you go to Rand as opposed to someplace else? The answer was, they paid me more money. A capitalist at heart from the very beginning. But these intellectual giants, as they became, you know, they were allowed to choose their own topics, and they asked some of the most pressing questions, and they had fun doing it. And Rand spent a whole lot of time finding and nurturing those people. And he was inspired by this and took this approach with him to the Department of Defense, where he was the director of net assessment for over 40 years. And what we've done here with the book is it covers Andy's thinking throughout his career, for the most part. There, as Jeff McKitrick will talk about, there are probably some hidden interviews or undiscovered interviews that will show up in the future, but not intentionally. And Andy worked for 6 U.S. presidents, and it really offers us a window into his world. I know that there are friends of Andy who will look you in the eye and tell you that Andy didn't talk much. And I have to tell you, the silence was a bit disconcerting. But Reflections on Net Assessment is Andy's voice. The book is not a light read. It's dense, it's complex, and it's complicated. And the format is not what you'd expect, but make no mistake about it. It's Andy Marshall's voice. It's a story about people and ideas. And I urge you to read the book from start to finish. Then put it down, pick it up again, and read it again, starting wherever you want. Because the book it's inherently consistent. And it works looking at it from a lot of different ways and a lot of different people. And then once you're finished with it the second time, turn around and give it to somebody else to read and talk with them about it. So I want to go through some mechanical notes here, which I always screw up. So first of all, the speakers and moderators today are participating in their personal capacity and do not necessarily represent the views of their employers, although I'm speaking in my capacity as the chairman of the Andrew W. Marshall Foundation. So if you want to quote me, make sure you misquote me like everybody else does. Second, we'll close with an audience Q&A. And so please submit your questions you have for our speakers via email to the Andrew W. Marshall Foundation. We'll get them. We will make sure that we get your questions asked, and with the panel that we have, you'll get some terrific answers. And for our virtual audience, the email address is in the Zoom chat. So we'll be hearing from the book's 2 editors to start, Jeff McKitrick and Bob Angevine, who through their decades of experience working inside or supporting the Office of Net Assessment at the Department of Defense, were well positioned to weave Andy's interviews together masterfully. I first met Jeff back in the mid-'80s when he was young and I wasn't. And it was a friendship that worked. And I actually got to watch Jeff deal with Andy and suffer in some cases. But I'm here to say that over the years, when Andy Marshall talks about the art of net assessment, he has always told me that the best net assessment ever written for him was by Jeff McKitrick. And it was on the Central Front. And probably we ought to pull that out of the vault and something and look again and see what's happening with the Russians. It would be a good a good look at what we thought about back then and where we actually see them now. So Jeff is a research staff member at IDA. He served as a military assistant to Andy and as a military advisor and special assistant to the Vice President of the United States. Bob Angevine is also a research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analysis. He's taught at George Washington University, George Mason University, American University, Duke University. Can't get enough of Andy Bob. But he brilliant in his own right. And it was a pleasure working with Bob. Bob has also been very involved with the Andrew W. Marshall Papers and running the piece on future revolutions in military affairs, which you can see on the website. So they'll be joined by our moderator, yet another great friend, longtime friend, Vago Muradian, editor-in-chief of Defense and Aerospace Report. He's been an international security reporter, editor, commentator, and broadcaster for, gosh, is this real? 25 years?
30, more than 30. Yeah,
Oh.
that's all.
I was going to say like 6, but
Yeah, thank you very much, Jamie.
I didn't think you were that old.
I gotta
I
come
didn't think
back
you were that
more
old.
often.
Yeah, for 30. And he's a very long time friend, mentor, and colleague of mine and of Andy's. So so Vago, I think I turn it over to you now.
I would be honored, Jamie. Thanks very much. First, I just want to thank my dear friend Jamie in particular for his instrumental role in creating the foundation to keep Andy's legacy of what I think is absolutely one of the most critical times in our national security history, with a very different kind of adversary that's operating very differently than our Soviet friends, and the Andy's interdisciplinary model, which I want to draw out from Jeff and Bob in this conversation, I think is something particularly important. I lament I never enjoyed the fullness of Andy's French food. Jamie would occasionally taunt me. We had a common love of cassoulet, so I never had that. So I would like to be able to get Andy's recipe for that, Jamie, at some point, if we could do that. But in all seriousness, I know that Andy would sometimes lament late in his life, how, whether or not I was as good of a watchman. Did I give that warning as early as possible? And I would say that actually he was a great success, because he generated the kind of talent that's in this room and across the national security community, and create those minds who can actually take this competition where it's going. So I'm honored and to be here, truly, and humbled to be having this conversation. Jeff, why don't you start us off about why this book is so important today, why people should read it, right? I mean, aside from the vast fortune, clearly, that you guys are going to make from this, which all will be donated to the foundation, of course. Why is this such an important book now?
Thanks, Vago. First, let me just add my thanks to Ida and the Andrew Marshall Foundation for supporting this project. The book wouldn't have happened without that, so thank you very much for that support. I will note, Dan mentioned how long the book has been in the making. I'll just point out that it was in security review for 18 months. And there's some speculation the reviewer was an historian and he was having so much fun reading it that he spent more time reading it and thinking about it than actually doing the security review, but it finally did pass. And so we were able to make it available. For me, I think one of the main reasons that national security practitioners and analysts will be interested in this book is that Andy talks in his own words about the long-term competition, and how the long-term competition with the Soviet Union really was kind of an organizing principle, if you will, for how to think about America's role in the world and America's standing. And that led to a whole number of things. It led to an emphasis on looking at the competitor and what does the competitor think? What's the competitor's assessment of the military balance? What are the advantages the competitor has, the disadvantages, and what are the things that leads the competitor to make those kinds of decisions? Their history, their culture, their resource constraints, demographic, technological, financial. Those things all shape the decision-making of the Soviet Union, shaped in such a way that it led them to do things that we might think were a little bit strange. For example, they thought that our ICBM force with Minutemen was a first strike capability because we had built the silos too close together. And so they were vulnerable to a first strike from the Soviet Union. Well, we didn't think we built them too close together, but our measure of effectiveness was whether or not they could crush the headworks on each silo and prevent the doors from opening and us launching. They had a different MOE. Their MOE was, can the ground shock from a nuclear burst nearby deform the silo so that the missiles can't come out? And when you look at it that way, yes, they were too close, but we never understood why they thought that was their first strike capability, because that was a totally different MOE than we used. So that's just, there are a ton of those kinds of examples about how they thought differently. And this framework of the long-term competition and looking for those kinds of asymmetries were very important to Andy, and looking for trends in the kinds of force developments over decades, not over budget cycles, that really let you understand what the big important issues were. So for today, we have a different competitor. We have China, and it's a similar sort of situation. They think differently about things than we do. Their history is very different and pushes them in directions that we might think are a little bit strange. Like, why would they do that? But if you go look at them and you look at their cultures and you look at their organizations and the different organizations that have influence on decision making, it pushes and pulls them in directions that it's more understandable. You can't really predict where they're going to go, but you might do some forecasts where they're going to go, because some of the constraints and restraints that they face are not easily changed. They can't change their cultures overnight. They can't change their organizational behavior overnight. And whether or not the PLA rocket force is really very, very important or not, they can't change that. It is what it is. So I think that's why this will be very relevant today for people that are interested in U.S. national security and how we're going to deal with this unfolding threat to the United States national security.
Bob, do you want to add anything to that before I ask you a technical question on how the book was born?
No, go ahead and ask the question.
So Bob, how was the book born?
So, as we note in the introduction, Andy had done these interviews in the mid-90s, and I should credit Kurt Guthey, who is the person who actually conducted the interviews. And Jeff had a typewritten transcript of the interviews in his possession. And there are a number of other transcripts floating around, but they were largely inaccessible. You had to kind of know somebody who had one and be able to use it that way. So finally, we ended up scanning all of the transcripts, and one of our great research assistants, Pat Savage, then went through and proofread all of the transcripts, trying to find all the errors that optical character recognition introduces. And then it was up to Jeff and myself to do the editing. And our goal was really to preserve Andy's voice. So we tried to do as little editing as possible, but these were kind of informal interviews. So there were a lot of kind of uhs and yeahs and filler words, and we tried to eliminate those to improve readability.
Except right. We left right
Right.
there every time.
And
With long pauses on either side of that.
right. And the other thing we did was anonymize the questioners. So there are, I think, 8 different questioners who participated in the interviews. And we did that really because we wanted to keep the focus on Andy and his ideas rather than on what one of the questioners might be saying versus another one. And then it was a matter of doing the copy editing and layout. And our editor, who's there in the back of the room, Carolyn Leonard, was absolutely fantastic. She did not only all the copy editing, but the layout and even the cover design.
Right.
And then it's just a matter of getting through the self-publishing process, because we chose, both because of the way the project worked, to publish it kind of independently through Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And that was kind of a little bit of an adventure on its own, trying to figure out how to get the manuscript into those platforms, but I think it turned out pretty well.
Yeah, go ahead.
Too. So I think one of the other things is that the book was not intended to be produced this way. The original intent was the interviews would then be put together into some stories, like a real book. And but it would require the interaction with Andy. And by the time we got around doing this, Andy was gone. And so we thought that's not going to be possible. And so the best thing is to put out Andy's words as Andy said them, let people read them, think about them, digest them, on their own. It makes it more difficult. And as Jamie said, it makes it more dense and more complicated, but I think it makes it more useful. And in that regard, we also put in the outlines that Andy made for each interview session. And the reason we did that was because it showed what Andy's thinking was for that session. And then some of the topics that he had listed there were never covered in the interview. But it's useful, I think, for the reader to note that these topics were on Andy's mind for that period of time. It's just they didn't get covered in the interview. And then finally, there were 2 interviews that were done in 1999, in July 99, that basically were a more homogenized, synthesized presentation of what happened in the Nixon-Ford years. And we kind of struggled with what to do with those because we already had his interviews from the Nixon-Ford years. And so what should we do with these? Because in some ways they're duplicative and repetitive, but we read them again, and in many ways they were not. There was more value added there than what they'd done the first go around. So we put them in as they were conducted, again, with the notion of getting Andy's voice out there on these topics. So I think this is a very different kind of book than what Andy had envisioned, but I hope people find it to be interesting and useful.
I can't commend the book enough. And, as somebody who's done a lot of interviews and tried to transcribe them and to convey the voice of the person you're interviewing, you guys did a tremendous job, because it does sound like it's Andy talking to you, without the, in a more sort of fluid way sometimes than was his style of just going right. And you're like, and or it's like, well, it was more money, and you're like, oh, okay, all right, that makes sense. For this is aimed at whichever of you wants to take on this question, right? I mean, anytime there's the word net assessment, there are folks who understand it. I think everybody in this room understands it. There are many in national security understand it, and I actually think that there may be some people in the audience who don't exactly know what that means. So do one of you want to give sort of one, Jeff, why don't you start us off on, what is net assessment and why is net assessment so important? Because, as Tom Earhart used to say, any successful organization, if it doesn't have a net assessment capability, is not a serious organization.
Well, I love Tom, but I would disagree with that. Not every organization needs.
That's panel discussion too.
But the concept of net assessment, and he sort of evolved over time. It wasn't born, out of whole cloth. And so he kept adding things as he went along and adding things as he went along. But the basic notion was, if you have this long-term competition, how do you understand it? How do you diagnose it? How do you tell who's ahead and who's behind? And so his notion was that you would take a look at the different areas. So, for example, with the competition of the Soviet Union, he looked at the strategic nuclear balance. He looked at the NATO Warsaw Pact balance, which I prepared. He looked at the maritime balance. He looked at the undersea balance. He looked at a number of areas of military competition, and had a set net assessments prepared to try and judge who was ahead, who was behind, what were the long-term trends, where does it look like this competition is going into the future? Are there certain asymmetries that we can capitalize on and maybe gain some new advantages, or at least maintain some of the advantages we have, like in undersea warfare? And so as a diagnostic tool meant to help senior decision makers think about and understand the nature of the competition and help them think about, okay, well, what might we do here to try to take advantage of this assessment and some of the things that it highlights. In mine, for example, one of the things that was highlighted for the first time in the assessment was the whole revolution of military affairs concept that I wrote mine in the mid 80s, and Marshal Ogarkov, the chief of the general staff, had published a book in 82 that talked about how future warfare was going to change because of these new technologies and things like long-range precision strike, or as they called it, constant strike complexes, were going to be really, really important and would be able to do things that previously only nuclear weapons could do. And so these net assessments identified those kinds of opportunities. So it suggested in that case, maybe the United States should take a really hard look at the RMA and think about ways to capitalize on that. So they were not meant to be prescriptive. In a good world, you would have in the Defense Department a strategic planning office that the net assessments would feed into, and then the strategic planning office would develop strategies. For a while, we got the department looking at things called competitive strategies that were building on the long-term competition, and how might the department take advantage of some of the weaknesses with the Soviet Union, and build these strategies that would unfold over time, and improve our standing in certain areas. So that's kind of a thumbnail sketch of it, of a very complicated and complex tool technique approach, if you will.
Bob, do you want to add anything?
Well, I would just say, and Jeff mentioned that Andy's thinking kind of evolved, and one of, I guess, the defining characteristics of net assessment is its lack of defining characteristics, that
Right.
it is fundamentally a very kind of eclectic enterprise that really emphasizes both multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary work. And you see it in the kinds of things that Andy talks about in the book. So, you know, at one point, literally within the same paragraph, I think, he's talking about what research on vervet monkeys' blood chemistry tells him about human behavior, and then what kind of histories of Christopher Columbus's expeditions to the New World told him about how people think differently. And it's that ability, I think, to combine insights from just a broad range of disciplines that really fed his thinking on net assessment. So he famously kind of never really gave people who worked in the office like Jeff or Dakota instructions, here's how to do a net assessment. And this book does not have,
Right.
you won't,
There's
by
no
reading,
question, John.
by reading it, you're not going to come out saying, okay, now I know how to do a net assessment.
Right.
But you might come out thinking, okay, here are the kinds of broad things I can think about and the kinds of disciplines I can throw into the mix in order to gain some of the insights that Andy Marshall came up with.
So that takes me to the next question. You know, anybody who knew, and right, I mean, there's the legendary figure, but then there was the interdisciplinary thinker who was also an extraordinarily, you know, decent man who was devoid of ego in a town where, you know, like there are people with no accomplishments who have giant egos. And here was somebody with tremendous accomplishments. And the first thing he would do is compliment everybody else for the work that they were doing as opposed to what he was doing. What was so special about his interdisciplinary method? You know, you talked about monkey blood. There were a lot of other examples, right? I mean, because he was actually, you know, seminal in economic work, for example, before they actually became fields. So walk us through some of the things, you know, on behavioral economics and a whole bunch of other things that Andy was doing before they were actually even formal fields. And he was sort of bringing all of this stuff together to sort of be like, hey, how do we think through this problem better?
Yeah,
Or get the question right?
you know, I said to some people that Andy was kind of doing behavioral economics before it was even really a field, right? And so one of my favorite episodes in the book is in the mid-1950s, when he's still at Rand, Rand was working on a project looking at kind of the Soviet intercontinental mission. And one of the big questions in that project was, where are the Soviet bomber bases? And at the time, nobody really knew because there were no satellites. The U-2 had really only just started flying, and access to that intelligence and other intelligence was very limited. So the Rand researchers who were working on the project were kind of speculating, and their speculation was, well, the Soviets will probably put those bomber bases along the Trans-Siberian Railroad, right? Because they'll be easy to access and very remote, far from the coast, and therefore very secure. And Andy, you know, who did actually have access to the intelligence and knew where the bomber bases were, but couldn't tell them, you know, just started questioning them and saying, well, where are our bomber bases? Aren't they kind of, and when were they established? They were established when airplanes didn't have the kind of range they did in the 1950s. So they were all established close to things that they would want to hit. So they were, in fact, all are near the coast. And why would anybody move a bomber base once it's built unless there was some really compelling reason? So it's that kind of ability to think through things and understand behavior that is not purely rational. And I think also what was interesting in that episode is that Andy's kind of constantly questioning the researchers and making them not just support their conclusions, but question those conclusions. And of course, what's most interesting is that then finally in the early 1960s, when the U-2 was shot down, Alan Enthoven from RAND comes up to Andy in the parking lot and says, "Oh, now I know what you were talking about back then." So,
well, right. I mean, that's the key to mentorship, is knowing how it is that you bring people up. Jeff, do you want to sort of?
Well, I think one of the things on this multidisciplinary thing, Andy was a big believer in talking to people that actually knew something, that actually went out there and talked to people that they visited these countries. They interacted with people in these countries, whether they were businessmen or missionaries or other walks of life. And so he found that to be really a great source of information. He was not, even though he had these accesses at RAND in the 50s, these special intelligence accesses, he was what we call an all source kind of guy. He believed that there were a lot of things that were in the open source, were not classified, frankly, weren't even being collected. Maybe they should have been by the intelligence community with human intelligence. But he was always looking for people, for emigres from the Soviet Union that could tell him, well, what's it really like in there? What's the mortality rate really like? What's the life expectancy? What's really going on over there? And so he had insights into our competitor that he didn't get from the intelligence community. And one of my favorite stories in that regard is actually after this period of time, but when a new well, I guess we won't get into that, but there was some discussion about China, and there's some speculation that China is adopting what's called an anti-access area denial capability. And this is, very early on, and there's not a lot of intelligence community proof. And he actually sends a request to the intelligence community and says, hey, are there indications that China is pursuing this anti-access area denial capability? And he gets back this, guess what? No. There are no indications that they're pursuing this. He's like, yeah, right. So some months later, one of his researchers is reading some Chinese literature, and they talk about the strategic importance of a particular province in China. And so Andy goes, well, why would they think that's so important? It's not even close to anything that's important. And so he asks the NRO to go take a picture. There's some pictures of the province. And they come back and they've got a picture of an over-the-horizon radar that's being built. Now, why would you build an over-the-horizon radar unless you're interested in detecting the approach of forces from a long way away and trying to take steps to stop them from approaching anti-access area denial capability? So his ability to tap into these sources of information beyond the intelligence community was really very important, and I think gave him a tremendous edge in terms of his strategic analysis over other people.
So, right. I mean, one of his dictums was to, know your adversary, right? Don't necessarily mirror image, but be also smart enough to know, right? I mean, you guys have, I underlined this, it was fairly early in the book, where the position that I can't see well if I put my thing up, but anyway, it's about our expectation that, well, they wouldn't have weaknesses. They would keep building and improving their capabilities, almost taking, sort of our sort of Six Sigma approach to things. And Andy's point was like, yeah, well, we're not really doing that either. And we're not really addressing our weaknesses. So why wouldn't they have bureaucratic challenges and problems on their own? And it seems like even though we did a lot of work, right, there was a bifurcation of, two schools of thought, for example, on the Russians, that they're 10 feet tall and they're going to be, they'll be in Kiev in 2 days. Or that it's a clown show, really, that masquerades itself with a few muscular elements. What are some of the episodes and approaches that you think are most important when we're looking at China and getting China right and not making the same sort of mistakes that we've made at whatever level with our Russian friends, that they may not have been, understanding fully, right, that the Russians are not fighting us the way that they're not fighting the Ukrainians the way they would likely fight us. But what are some of the things from history and the net assessment approach and Andy's thinking do you think is most applicable when we start looking at the China problem, where a lot is available at this point, right? They're a little bit more clearer on intentions, and the nature of the challenge is different, resource-wise and otherwise.
Really? They're a lot more clearer on intentions. I don't know. Remember all these ICBM silos that they started putting in all of a sudden, and then because we thought for a long time, why would they do ICBM silos? They've got, so, all these mobile missiles and everything, and then all of a sudden these fields start getting put in. I'm not so sure they're all that clear on their intentions. some people like Jackie Deal have been spending a lot of time trying to get it made more clear in her research and support for the offset net assessment. But I think it's, the old saying about it's what, triple encrypted, and the first level of encryption is the Chinese language.
Right.
And we just don't have people, experts enough that understand that and read it.
And just to clarify, what I meant by that is, it's now abundantly clear they're up to no good, right? That you can't explain it away. That's what I'm.
They're not up to no good. They're up to their own good. That's
Right.
the difference. So, if you go back and look at the Commission on Integrated Long-Term Strategy and the future security environment that Andy worked on with Charlie Wolf, and they described the future security environment, they saw the collapse of the Soviet Union coming about because it just was not a sustainable model.
Right.
But they also saw the rise of China because of its economic potential and the population there. And so I think that's one of the things that you get when you look across the board in a number of these different disciplines, and a number of these different areas, get a better appreciation of what the enemy's trying to do, or what the adversary is trying to do, or what the competitor is trying to do, what they're trying to accomplish. And those objectives are not going to be the same as ours. It's not going to be a symmetrical situation. And they're going to be trying to achieve things like, why are they doing that? I mean, I remember one time Andy told me that we found out that the Soviets were targeting an ICBM at an island out in the middle of the ocean. We're like, why would you use an ICBM to target an island in the middle of the ocean? And so he starts checking on the US side, and guess what? We had an intelligence collection site there. And it was important to the Soviets that we not be able to collect the intelligence that we were trying to collect. And the only way they had to make sure that we couldn't do that was to hit it with an ICBM. We're like, dude, that's not cost effective. Why would you do that? Well, they did it because they needed to do that to make their operational plan work. So it leads the opponent to take actions, to do planning, to build forces that we don't understand why they do that. Why do they have two heavy ICBMs, an 18 and a 19? Why is that? Well, maybe it's because Khrushchev's son worked in one of the design bureaus. And so the leaders are like, we can't decide here. Let's just build both of them and make everybody happy. So those kind of bureaucratic organizational things. I think Andy was really interested in trying to suss those out and see what the implications were.
Well, you mentioned in your introduction the notion of constraints or weaknesses, right? And that was something that Andy kind of constantly emphasizes, that we typically, and the intelligence community in particular, typically focuses on an adversary's capabilities and tends to focus on worst case analysis, right? This is what an adversary could do with their capabilities. And Andy would often kind of question that. And I think one of the outstanding cases is in the 70s, when he started raising questions about our understanding of Soviet military spending as a percentage of GDP, and said, if they're fielding the kinds of capabilities we're seeing with the level of defense spending that we think they're spending, then either they must have a much larger economy, right? Because we're estimating that they're spending some percentage of GDP, and yet they're getting all of these military capabilities in the field. So either they're spending a lot more in terms of defense spending, or they have a much larger economy. And I think you could apply some of that skeptical analysis to current thinking about China, right? I mean, to what extent we tend to think, oh my God, they're building all of these ships and all of these other military capabilities. Well, how much of it is any good, and how much of it is crowding out spending that might be better used elsewhere? And just kind of a much more skeptical analysis of both capabilities and intention.
I have gotten a text from Tom saying that I have misquoted him. You referenced my first law of net assessment. Every organization needs an office of net assessment. The second law is every organization's bureaucracy is allergic to an office of net assessment. So, Tom, A, thank you very much for listening. B, thank you for the correction. And I stand corrected, and am sorry for having made that error. Do we want to, do either of you want to add, because I think in the course of both of your answers across these questions, you guys have sort of mentioned what some of the milestone work is. Clearly, a lot of the work remains classified. You've already checked yourself twice. in terms of not letting get any cat's Jeff out of the bag. What are some other sort of milestone pieces of work, or is it better actually to think, in the way that I did in the mentoring that I received over decades from people in this room, especially who, I got to know Andy later in life better, but was sort of the method and how to think about problems and how to ask the right question and all of that. But from your guys' perspective, are there any other sort of instances and milestone moments or work product over the last, in the 7 decades of his career that, you guys think is particularly, noteworthy as, hey, this is a way of doing something right that we could learn a lot from today?
I think first you have to recognize how Andy viewed his role. His role was to be an advisor to senior decision makers and to provide private advice to senior decision makers. And by keeping it private and keeping it highly classified, the ducks didn't get to peck him to death before he finished, working on a particular project. And the long knives of the bureaucratic competitors within the Defense Department couldn't get him. He got to render unvarnished truth to power. So I think he saw that as his role, and so he wasn't particularly interested in putting things out there that were going to be meant for public consumption or mass consumption. He was not trying to shape the thinking of the American body politic. He's trying to shape the thinking of decision makers and future decision makers in terms of how they approach a particular problem. So yes, a lot of this stuff still highly classified. There are some things that he talks about in here. The maritime strategy that Jim Roach worked on led to some things that we did that are still classified, but they made a difference. I think one of the sort of outstanding exceptions that proves the rule was in the last chapter in this book, which only goes through the Clinton administration. We talk about the MTR assessment, the military technology revolution MTR assessment that Andy Krepinevich did. That was unclassified, and it was done purposely to get people to think about future warfare in ways that he didn't see them thinking. And so he was trying to influence thinking by a broader group of people when he put that out. And it led to a whole decade's worth of work on what then became the Revolution Military Affairs, of workshops and war games with the different military services, trying to shape the thinking of the military officers that were participating in those events. And I remember when Paul Selva, who ended up retiring as a 4-star and vice chairman and was nice enough to say good things about this book, when he was a 2-star and he was the head of Air Force strategy. And he recalled the RMA war games that assessment ran with the Air Force. And he was the Air Force military assistant in that assessment. And he said those were very, very influential in getting the Air Force to think about UAVs in ways that it really hadn't been, that it had resisted vigorously because of the pilot mafia, primarily fighter pilot, but also bomber pilot. And those war games that we ran really infected the thinking of a lot of junior military officers. And as they grew up, they had these thoughts with them and the importance of UAVs and the contributions UAVs could make. So that was one example. There were other areas like long-range precision strike, information warfare, space warfare. Those things are all with us today. And they're all being pursued as areas of military capability and expertise, and not just by us, but also by our competitors, so by the way. So I think for me, one of the things that came out of rereading this again was how he saw that back in the 90s as a future of warfare and where it might go, and work to get people thinking about that.
I mean, was that, but right, I mean, in as much as you said that, right, his role was to advise at the senior-most leadership, isn't it arguable that actually he set the conditions for these debates, right? Because when I was writing about some of that stuff in, around the mid-90s, about, well, what do these capabilities mean as they get more proliferated and then get turned around on us, right? And there were a lot of folks who were saying, oh, it's unlikely to happen and all of that. I mean, Bob, would you say that it was sort of the brand of thinking and the apostles sort of all going out there and talking about this that actually did set the conditions for remarkably important public debates, because smart folks were asking, these questions, even some in Congress, we're asking some of these questions all the way back then.
No, I think that's exactly right. And, it was through the 90s and up until September 11th, 2001, that was the dominant focus of kind of military and national security debate and policy. And one of the things I think Andy was always a little bit mystified by was the failure of both the United States and many of its competitors to do anything about it from, say, 2000 on until, the last several years. And for the United States anyways, we were on a 20-year kind of detour is probably not the right word, but we went on a different path for roughly 20 years fighting counterinsurgency and terrorists. And building some of these capabilities that Jeff described, but for use in a different kind of conflict. And now we're starting again to see some of these things, really come back to the forefront.
We are now going to go to the question and answer part of the discussion. I'm getting a nod from Stephanie, which is good. Question one, what did Andy not cover in the interviews that you wish he did?
Well, the first thing is the interviews end with the Clinton administration. So I've talked to Jamie and said, we need to talk about net assessment, from then up until the time that he retired, because he had another couple decade plus, 2 decades actually. When the last real substantive interview was 95, and there were 2 catch-up ones in 99, but they were sort of complete the record. So that's one thing that's not in the book, and that is sort of the second half of his net assessment career, where he was working these issues, really particularly focused on China, because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and really that doesn't come back to be a problem again until Putin gets elected in 2000. That's a big thing that's missing. The other, I guess, another thing that's missing is that there's not a lot of discussion about the Vietnam War in here. Somebody once asked me, how come, Andy didn't at least do like a lessons learned on, U.S. involvement in Vietnam, et cetera. And I asked him that once. I said, why didn't you or the office, or even before that, when you were at RAND, why were you not particularly interested in the U.S. involvement in Vietnam? He said, well, 2 reasons. One, he said he didn't see that as being an existential threat to the United States. And he thought that he could better use his time, resources, and energy looking at the Soviet Union and the long-term competition with the Soviet Union. And he said, and secondly, there were so many people and so many organizations looking at U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And he said, it's not clear that I could have made much of a difference in that debate.
Right.
So he wanted to focus really on the things where he thought they were really important and he could make a difference.
I remember him talking about that in exactly those terms. Did you want to add anything?
Of course, Jeff has mentioned a couple of classified assessments, and of course, as a historian, I'm most interested in all the secret details. And this is a completely unclassified work. And Jeff mentioned the security review, which even after 18 months, there were almost no edits made, which again leads us to believe that somebody just really liked to read it. But so this is a broadly accessible book, but it doesn't get into some of the more classified details, which just like I said, as a historian, I'd love to read more about that, but obviously couldn't publish it.
I'm going to ask Jamie to come up here because he wants to weigh in on the second audience question, which I vaguely suspect he may have planted. I'm not accusing Stephanie of being complicit in this. So as was so often the case, Andy had a tendency of saying things, and then that sort of led to like 29 additional questions you could have. We could have done a 3-day seminar version of this, and I think we could actually maintain a large portion of this audience. So what are the new questions did the interview raise? Jamie, do you want to, start this one off and then kind of go down the line?
Actually, I didn't plant the question. I didn't plant the next question either, but
But that shows understanding of what's to come, doesn't
Yes,
it?
exactly. Jeff, I'm gonna let you start with this answer.
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question. What is it you're trying to
Well,
get?
what are the new questions that these interviews raise, right? I mean, with the, aside from, you mentioned a little bit of that about what was to come, but what were some of the, if you had Andy sitting in front of you after you did all of this work, what were the additional questions you would ask him? Or want to ask?
I don't know. Obviously, I haven't thought about that before, and I'm a bit of a disadvantage because I did ask him all those questions while he was alive. So I'm not sure.
If you want to come back on it, we can come
I
back
don't
on it.
really, I don't have anything on that, except for this notion that I do think that we ought to try at some time to capture the other half of his career and that assessment and how that continued to evolve. The office continued to evolve. He continued to evolve, and the kinds of issues that they were looking at, from 1995 up to 2015, because they were, again, look at GWAT. Was he looking at GWAT? Not particularly.
Right.
Just like he wasn't looking at Vietnam.
Right.
GWAT, Global War on Terror.
Right. I mean, he did have me once take a look in 2002, I think it was, at what kinds of RMA types of weapons were we using in Afghanistan and OEF. I mean, how were we able to take some of these RMA weapons and use them in Operation Enduring Freedom? But I think that was more for his own edification about, did these things all just stop? Because you have to remember when Bush was elected, Bush II, when he campaigned, he gave a speech at the Citadel in 1999 as a candidate, where he was talking about the RMA and how the RMA was really the future of warfare. And of course, one of Andy's acolytes had put that in the speech.
That was the whole skip a generation of capability and get to where we need to be.
Right. And he talked about long-range precision strike and some of these kinds of things. So when he became president and Rumsfeld came in, Rumsfeld was very much attuned to this. And he asked Andy to do a strategy review, take 6 months, review the defense strategy. He told the department he was having Andy do that and leave Andy alone. He's going to do this. And so Andy did that. And the department, he had Jim Roach was in there as a retired Navy captain, Secretary of the Air Force. But, you had Paul Wolfowitz and you had a lot of these.
Art Zabrowski was Office of Force Transformation.
So you had a lot of these Andy Marshall, I won't say acolytes, but people that had been listening to him, talking to him, working with him over the years, that were all kind of aligned on this RMA path. And they set up a program that they were going to engage in transformation. They were going to transform the force and make it a future warfare RMA type of force. And then 9/11.
Right.
And it all went zoop, just like that. And so for at least 10 years, probably 20, we were not really focused on the major competitors, and Andy was not focused on GWAT. He was still looking at China as an emerging competitor. So I think that's the big thing that's not in the book that needs to be looked at.
Let me follow on just real quick. So the areas, so I like Jeff and like a lot of people who would ask Andy questions, especially after the interviews, which some of us first saw him back in the 90s. Well, Andy spent most of his career at the Office of Net Assessment, and he's best known for his military analysis. As Bob pointed out, with the monkey blood in one sense. Andy was passionate about understanding various other areas and what the implications of them are. So he spent a lot of time with Herb Simon, who won the Nobel Prize in organizational behavior. He spent quite a bit of time in the early 60s at Harvard, the business school, with the folks that actually started thinking about competitive strategies back then, but they were doing business case analysis and started, from Andy's point of view, were the real experts on SWOT, on the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And he took that all in and started looking at what how that could be used in the evolution of his thinking about analysis and how to analyze things. In the 1980s, Andy was the first person in the Department of Defense who had the courage to put some money into AIDS research.
Yes, he did.
Yes, he did.
Jamie was in charge of that.
Yeah, and there was a personal side to it, but from Andy's perspective, we couldn't understand what was going on with AIDS in this country. We saw that it was getting to be a bigger and bigger problem. And he was interested in, we started talking, and he became interested in what the impact of AIDS or some sort of disease, a catastrophic disease, would mean to elite population, elite groups around the world, especially in places like Africa at the time, Asia, other places, if the elite groups were dying, in which case back then what we were seeing was that the elite groups in Africa were probably had the highest incident of AIDS of their populations. What would that mean for unrest, and how do you think about it? Jeff talked about the ICBM issue with the Russians. Andy started saying, okay, you know what? Let's look at where they're pouring concrete. Yeah, I mean, 80% of the Soviet concrete manufacturing and pouring wasn't going into Moscow and the cities. It was going into these places in the middle of nowhere. And all of a sudden you start focusing on them and you say, oh, there's a reason for that. So, yeah.
So that reminds me, one of the things that Andy really focused on a lot, starting in the 2000s, was on human performance. And he had a large number of studies done on human performance and how that performance might be modified. Physical, cognitive, social emotional performance. How it could be modified with drugs, with nutraceuticals, with machines. And he often said, one of the things we may want to ask early on in a war, in our next war, is what kind of drugs are the other guys on? And he knew, of course, from World War II that the Germans had amphetamines that were issued to the troops and stuff. And of course, the U.S. would issue to our bomber pilots, sort of super strong no-dos, right? So it'd keep them away. Now, a lot of times the pilots refused to take them because they thought it would jeopardize their flight status, and the flight surgeon wouldn't certify them, so they wouldn't take the drugs. But performance-enhancing drugs became a really interesting topic for him, and not only what we were doing, but what other countries were doing. And other countries like China don't seem to have the same kind of social, cultural constraints on them in terms of developing, testing, producing those kinds of things.
Right.
So we may end up at an asymmetric disadvantage in that competition.
Well, man-machine interface for us may mean a different thing to the Chinese, where there is literally a man-machine interface of a kind we're not
Let me just follow up because it's really important. The Hudson Institute is doing a project now on cognitive warfare, and that's sponsored in part by the foundation, and it was driven by the human performance work that Andy was having done by Tom Earhart and others. But also in his later years, Andy started talking, they really did talk, about this notion of cognitive warfare, which is mind warfare. He wasn't interested in cyber anymore. I mean, cyber he was thinking about in the 1980s and 1990s. Information warfare, he was thinking about that. This was about the human mind and the power of this little 3.5-4 pound blob, that was the most sophisticated computer in the history of mankind, probably the history of the universe. How could you do things to that with opponents, with friends, to get them to think differently about war? So everything changes from that perspective. You start thinking about, what does deterrence really mean? You're not deterring, it's not a nuclear weapon. It's not, it's getting somebody like Treston Lee to think differently or not make a decision that he needs to make. Anyways.
I am told the time, but I have to add 2 minutes to this to answer what I think is an excellent question. How do people outside of defense, how can people outside defense use Andy's way of thinking to achieve their objectives, for example, in business or in technology? Bob, do you want to take a bite at that one?
Well, sure. I mean, and Jeff and I have talked to people who are employing kind of net assessment principles and the methodology outside of business to, analyze the competition, right? To understand what are the trends that are going on? What are the appropriate metrics that you need to monitor? What are your opponent's strengths, but also significantly, and this is something, as we mentioned, that Andy always emphasized, what are your opponent's weaknesses? How might you capitalize them? And then, lastly, and probably the hardest thing to do is analyze your own strengths and weaknesses, right? And that's where the net part of net assessment comes in, is understanding that balance between your opponent and yourself. So, I mean, I think it has been done. There are people who do it, and its utility is not just limited to national security.
I just add that Andy once told me he thought he probably should have called it strategic assessments, not net assessments. He thought net assessments confused too many people. They didn't understand you were trying to rack and stack advantages and disadvantages and look at the net balance. So that was too confusing. He thought in retrospect, he probably should have called it strategic assessments. I demurred and said, no, you should have called it net assessment so that people didn't understand what you were doing. You could keep it obscure for as long as you did so that you could provide advice.
Okay, but his adversaries also use that as a weapon incessantly against him, right? Oh, this is mumbo jumbo you guys, you're engaged in, and why do you need to know about monkey blood and stuff like that? And they were the ones, I think, who were missing the point. It's an honor, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Tremendous work. I commend everybody to get the book, to read it. And actually, as Jamie said, as you go through it, you find a lot in there. And at any point you open, it's one of the only books I know where at any point you open it, you find something really, really interesting in it. So I commend you. You don't have to be just an Andy Marshall fan in order to get a lot out of this book. So thanks very much. And it's a really honor to be here and to be part of this great event and the work you guys are doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Vago, Bob, Jeff, it is fabulous. I mean, just couldn't have three better people doing this. Dan, Ida, thank you again. I think that I know you mentioned her at the beginning, but Carolyn Leonard, I don't know if she's
right back.
I know she's back there, but if she's shy, she can stay back there. Otherwise, we will put her on camera. But this would not have been done without her. And I apologize we didn't get to the questions. I just talked too much. But we will get back to you and keep sending your questions and reach out to Jeff and Bob and Vago and all of us. But this has been a great conversation. I'd be remiss to, because Vago mentioned all the money we're making.
Donate.
You can buy the book, which was just published this Tuesday. Yes, donate would be great as well. It's available digitally on Kindle and paperback on Amazon and hard copy on Barnes and Noble. And most importantly, we at the foundation want to hear what you think of it. The book, the foundation. Please engage with us, ask more questions, and we're happy to work with you, but we are only as good as you are with us. So thank you again for being here today.